In this video, we are going to go over the answer key for problem set 6. This chapter revolved around the idea of probabilities and other types of sampling techniques and distributions. And so with that being said, let's take a look at question number 1. Among 480 juvenile cases referred to the St. Louis County Court, 180 were for property offenses, 120 for public order offenses, 90 for violent offenses, 60 for drug-related offenses, and 30 for truancy offenses. What is the probability that a randomly selected juvenile case involved either a public order or drug-related offense? And so remember that probabilities quantify uncertainty and are expressed as a number between 0 and 1, where 0 indicates an impossible event or that it won't occur, and 1 indicates a certain event will always occur. And so how we measure this is by taking the number of successes in our numerator and divide that by the total number of possible outcomes, which serves as our denominator. I think a key here, and where some of you ran into a little bit of trouble, is this aspect here, that this is a number between 0 and 1. There is no reason to convert this into a percentage at this time because we are simply just looking at the probability here. And so keep that in mind as we move forward with future problem sets as well as quizzes. And so again, looking back at the problem here, we need to figure out public order or drug-related offenses. And so if I go back up here a few lines, I see that there were 120 public order offenses and there were 60 drug-related offenses. So I need to add those both together here. That were our number of successes or our number that we are interested in this case. If I add those together, I get a total of 180. Then I need to divide that by the number of possible outcomes, or in other words, how many total offenses are in our sample. We know right from the top here that it is 480. If you wanted to double check yourself for whatever reason, you could go ahead and add together all of these independently. It would also give you a total of 480. And if you go ahead and take 180 divided by 480, you get a total of 0.375, and that is your probability in this case. Moving on to question 2. This is where we get more into our conversations about sampling techniques, and the next 4 questions cover the main ones that we did in our PowerPoint slides for this particular chapter. And so we have an example that covers each of those techniques. So starting off with question number 2. A criminologist is studying burglary cases in St. Louis. She obtains a complete list of all carjacking cases reported in the past year and assigns a unique number to each case. Using a random number generator, she selects 75 cases for in-depth analysis. Given this scenario, what type of sampling technique was utilized? Additionally, explain why this sampling technique is appropriate. So in this case, the criminologist is using a simple random sampling method. And we know this partially because of this section here. She's using a random number generator. She also has the complete list of all carjacking cases. And so in other words, she has the entire population at her disposal. But it doesn't make sense for her to do an in-depth analysis for all of these cases, right? It's not feasible and it's not efficient to do that. And so the random number generator allows her to simply be able to randomly select these cases in order to get a representative sample overall. And so that's what we're looking at here. Couple keys here. Each case within the population of the carjacking cases has an equal probability of being selected. So those are your 2 keys for a simple random sample. So that's what you should be looking for in any future problem sets or quizzes. This sampling technique is appropriate because it increases the likelihood that the sample is representative of the overall population of carjacking cases in St. Louis. So the more random we are, the less selection bias there might be because the researcher and the criminologist in this case isn't imposing any of her own bias in the selection process. It's completely random and they all have an equal chance. Moving on to question 3. The St. Charles Police Department wants to examine the workload and burnout levels among its officers. Using a roster of 300 officers organized alphabetically, researchers decide to interview every 20th officer on the list to gather insights about their experiences. Given this scenario, what type of sampling technique was utilized? Additionally, explain why this sampling technique is appropriate. And so right here, my key, if I were to read through this on the first go, are 2 keys. Organized alphabetically using a roster, and that we are interviewing every 20th officer. So let's take a look at our example prompt here below. The researchers are using systematic random sampling. And this sampling technique is appropriate because the officers are first selected from an ordered population. So that's what I kind of clued us in on this 20th officer from this roster of officers that is organized already alphabetically. And so that is our ordered population here. And we are also using a fixed interval. That is really the key here to knowing that you're using a systematic random sample. And that in this example is every 20th officer would be chosen in order to be further surveyed in this case and asked about their experiences. Again, this type of sampling is really for efficiency purposes. It's not feasible necessarily for these researchers to be able to interview all 300 officers. But again, because they're ordered, it is random, right? Besides it just being alphabetically, there's no real pattern in terms of that other than just the last name. And using a fixed interval does kind of add in some randomness to that as well. So the researchers don't necessarily know who the officers are in that alphabetical order, and they're just using every 20th officer within those lists. Moving on to question number 4. The St. Louis County Sheriff's Office wants to study perceptions of procedural justice among its deputies. The department employs 300 sworn officers working in 3 distinct divisions: patrol with 150 officers, investigations with 90 officers, and detention with 60 officers. Because workload and exposure to the public differ across divisions, researchers want to ensure each group is proportionately represented in the study. They first divide the roster into the 3 divisions and then randomly select 15% of officers from each group to participate in the survey. Given this scenario, what type of sampling technique was utilized? Additionally, explain why this sampling technique is appropriate. So again, if I'm just reading through this the first time, a couple of keys that are going off in my head. The first thing here is that I have 3 distinct divisions. And what's important here is that we want them to be proportionately represented in the study itself. If the researchers didn't care about that and they just wanted to take a look at officers overall within this department, then they could use a simple random sample, right? And they didn't necessarily care if they were from patrol or investigations or detention. But here, the researchers are specifically saying that they want proportional representation from each of these divisions. And so, moving on here, they divide the rosters into the 3 divisions and then randomly select 15% of officers from each group to participate in the survey. And so, the researchers are using stratified random sampling. The population here is divided into 3 strata. Naturally, right? We had 3 distinct divisions of patrol, investigations, and detention. And then the researchers randomly select the same proportions of participants from each stratum. So each individual group or distinct division here, which is 15% of officers. And in this case, this sampling technique is appropriate because it ensures that the final sample is proportionately representative of each subgroup. Or in other words, what we're doing is basically just making a mini sample from that 300 officer pool and having that be proportional in our smaller groups. So we have the same amount of representation from our patrol group, investigations, and detention groups as we would if we had that bigger group in the first place. And so again, the key here for stratified random sampling is making sure that our distinct groups still have proportional representation relative to their overall size. And so in this case, even though we're taking an equal amount in terms of percentage, because patrol has a higher amount of officers, within our sampling subgroup that would be created, there would still be more patrol officers, even though it's still 15%. And detention officers would have the least amount of individuals still represented. But again, that's what was occurring in our natural population of 300 officers. So we still want to reflect that within our subgroup. Again, proportionately representative is your key term here for stratified random sampling. And lastly, here with question 5. A criminologist wants to study inmate well-being across the state of Missouri. The state has 25 county jails, each housing between 150 and 800 inmates. Because it would be impractical to sample individuals from all jails, the researcher randomly selects 5 jails and surveys every inmate within those selected facilities. Given this scenario, what type of sampling technique was utilized? So in this case, the criminologist is using cluster sampling. In this case, we have a population, which is all of the inmates in the state within the county jails, and they are naturally divided into clusters, or what county jail they find themselves in. The criminologist then randomly selects entire clusters, or in other words, they select what county jails they will be interviewing all of the inmates in. So again, and then they include all the members of those selected clusters in the study. I briefly talked about in the PowerPoint presentation for this week the difference between 1-stage and 2-stage cluster sampling. It's not a big deal, and it wasn't necessarily a make or break for this question in particular. But just so you know, this is an example of 1-stage cluster sampling, because all we're doing here is doing that random selection at the first stage, but then we are interviewing all of the individuals in those selected clusters. There's no randomization again at that second stage. Or in other words, it would be 2 stages if we were to do randomization of the inmates in those facilities of those 5 that we selected in the first stage. This sampling technique is appropriate because there are naturally occurring clusters, our jails, and it is not practical for the criminologist to survey every single inmate across the state. And so we have naturally occurring boundaries here and naturally occurring clusters naturally. And so essentially with cluster sampling, it's really our most efficient sampling technique out of all of these, because we are dealing with wide geographic boundaries oftentimes, but we're still looking to get geographic variation throughout the state. And so in this case, there still is a randomness element to it in that the clusters themselves are randomly selected, but it very much cuts down, and in this case of this example, how many county jails we have to work with here. We're going from 25 to 5, right? Which reduces it by 80% in this case. So with that in mind, if you have any further questions about probabilities or sampling techniques, please feel free to stop by my office hours or set up an appointment with me. What the next couple of chapters will be looking like is really combining what we've done over the last 2 chapters. In chapter 5 with the normal distribution and now sampling techniques. This will come into play with the concepts of confidence intervals and hypothesis testing. So even though a lot of you did very well on this particular problem set, I want to make sure that everyone has a really strong foundation for this material, because it will still occur throughout the duration of the semester. And so with that being said, if you have any questions, of course, reach out. And I will see you in the next video.